Hi, Ross.
Hi, Ralph.
What's the date today?
It's the 18th of September, 2019,
Right.
and it happens to be my birthday.
Wow. What birthday is it?
It is my, gotta always remember this now, 78th birthday, born in 1941.
Right. And so, are you getting some calls and messages from people?
Yes, I am. I got a couple this morning, and I expect to get some more later on today.
Good. And we had a game of croquet.
We did, and the guys were victorious over the ladies for once, and it was. But then the weather came in and saved us from more grief.
Tell me a bit about your family. You've got a couple of grandkids and their parents living very close to you in Willa now.
There's Greg and Odette,
Yeah.
Willa's son, and his lovely wife, and they live in Rothsay, very close to us, which is nice because we get to see them quite often. They're just lovely kids, both of them. Allison and Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
Ryan is just now 18, very talented young lad. He's on his way into university and is an excellent skier, downhill skier. And Allison is following in his footsteps, downhill skiing and playing soccer as well.
And so, how old are they?
Allison is just now has turned 10, and Ryan is 18.
Right. So they're changing by the day.
Oh boy, I'll say. It's amazing how quickly these kids do change. I have a daughter in Toronto, Morgan, and she and her husband have a little boy, Rodeo, and he's just 2 years old, a real cute little guy, and we've been up to see him several times. And then I have a son, two sons in British Columbia. The one son, Philip, and his wife, Michelle, have been doing a lot of sailing lately and bought themselves a sailboat and are now living on a sailboat in Vancouver.
And they did a couple of trips, big trips before. Yeah.
Yes, they came out to New Brunswick here and spent about a couple of weeks with us. And during that time, they bought a sailboat, another sailboat, and then sailed down the coast to into the Florida, and then crossed over to the Abacos and spent about 8 or 9 months in the Abacos, sailing and really enjoying it and loving it, and then came back to New Brunswick, and then drove back to Nova Scotia. Drove back to British Columbia, where they then spent some time to see the other part of the family, and then came back and drove back to Florida, where they got on their sailboat again and sailed the Abacos once more, really enjoying it, and then left and sailed all the way up the coast to New Brunswick, where they moored out in front of our house at Harding's Point, and then had a visit. Then they turned around and took the boat to St. John, where they fixed it up and sold it within a matter of days, actually, and then drove back to British Columbia, where they have another boat moored, and before getting onto that, they decided to go and see a larger boat that they were looking at, and ended up buying this much larger boat. It's 42 feet, I believe, and are living on that now and enjoying it very much.
So, did you come from British Columbia?
Yes, I was born in New Westminster in 1941, and my father and mother always virtually lived in British Columbia. During that time, I spent some time working with the Bank of Montreal when I graduated, and worked throughout BC and the Yukon, and then I quit and got a job as working for a school board, where I then moved to Vancouver Island, and I was secretary-treasurer of a school district which had over 9,000 square miles in it, the north end of Vancouver Island, and onto the BC mainland. And it was a very beautiful part of the province. I did that for another 7 years, and then I met a fellow who enticed me to buy-in with him, and he and I bought out his mother and father, who ran a newspaper, local newspaper, the North Island Gazette. And we did so very successfully for about 12 years, and won a number of provincial and national editorial awards for our paper. And then when we sold it, I had the chance to go back back east. I went to Toronto, where I became executive director of the Canadian Community Newspapers Association, and I met my wife Willa, and she and I convinced her to move to Toronto from her home in Hardings Point and New Brunswick, and then we spent the first I think it was about 3 years of our marriage traveling Canada, visiting all the various community newspapers across the country, and whenever I had a function to go to, I asked that the board of directors allow me to take my wife, because I wanted to be with her, and they very kindly agreed, and we got to know many, many people across Canada, from Newfoundland to the Yukon.
And so how did the inn come about?
Well, when Will and I decided it was time to leave Toronto after I'd spent almost 5 years there, and she'd spent close to 3, and we said, look, it's time for us to move on to something else here. And I could either go back to BC, or we could go to the Maritimes. I said, I've never really lived in the Maritimes, and I wouldn't mind that at all. So we decided, Willa was quite pleased too, because that's where her home is. So we moved back to St. John, and she and I had always had this dream of wanting to have a country inn, and I like to do the cooking. I like to cook a lot, so that's exactly what we did. We ended up buying a big house, an old house on the Bay of Fundy, and started in on the Cove. I did pretty well all the cooking. Willa did the other parts of the business, and we did so quite successfully.
So how did the TV thing come about, where you got into on the cable station?
Yeah, well, I always enjoyed cooking a lot, and always wanted to. My dream had always been to host a TV cooking show or write a cookbook, and my wife said she had the same dream. So we put our heads together, and I went to the cable station in St. John and said, look, I want to host a television cooking show, and this is what I think we should call it, Tide's Table, because I had the image in my mind where I could see the opening shot of lovely cutlery and crockery and crystal on the sand as the tide was coming in slowly to it. It just seemed like the right thing to do. So they said, well, let's give it a try. We'll try a show and see how it goes. And people seemed to really like it, strangely enough. And so we ended up shooting 130 some shows, half-hour shows, from in on the Cove and around that area, all about cooking, maritime cooking, and all that it had to offer. And it was very well received and accepted.
And did it run in New Brunswick? That was the audience?
It ran in New Brunswick, and it also ran in through the main public television, which was what took it down into the state of Maine and parts of the United States as well.
You and Willa have done a couple of cookbooks or books.
Yes.
Tell me about those.
We went to Goose Lane Editions, who is a recognized party in Fredericton and publishing company, and told them what we wanted to do, and they said, yeah, we'd like to do it. So we ended up publishing two cookbooks, one of which became bestseller in Canada, and called Maritime Cooking from In on the Cove, and it was very successful. We had a lot of fun doing it too.
And what was the other one about?
It was the very same. It was called Maritime Cooking from In on the Cove, but it was outdoor cooking, mainly done on the barbecue and things like that.
Tell me about your mother. I got to meet her a couple of times.
Yes, Mum was a wonderful person. She was born in Scotland, and when she and her mother and father emigrated from Scotland to Canada, my father used to give her a tough time. He would say, look, the only way they got them off the ship was that they scattered oatmeal down the gangplank, and they followed the oatmeal to shore. He called them oatmeal savages. But
What was her name, your mother?
her name was Grace. Her single name was Grace Moses, but she was Grace Mavis, and a very, very nice person. But at the age of almost 84, she was living on her own and still in the north end of Vancouver Island after I left. She was still living there, and she said one day, I said to Mom, do you think you'd ever like to come out this way? She said, I think I would. I said, well, let's see if we can sell your house and you can move out here. So she put her house up for sale and sold it within a matter of weeks, and we then went and flew out and helped her load all her stuff up, and moved from the north end of Vancouver Island to downtown St. John, New Brunswick, where she lived at the age of 84. It was quite amazing that she could settle in as well as she did. Lived on her own in an apartment there, right downtown until she was, for 10 years. She was 94, 95, and then went into a nursing home briefly before she passed away at the age of 98.
And do you remember what her mother and father's names were?
What their names were?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was Lily and George Moses. They were my grandfather was my grandpa Moses. His son, his only son, Laurie, had his name changed to McIntosh, which was my grandmother's maiden name. She was a McIntosh, and because he said the kids gave him such a tough time all the time in school. But they were very, very nice.
Where in Scotland did they come from, do you know?
It was from Aberdeen, the Aberdeen area. Yep. I've never been. I've always wanted to go back to Scotland, to go to Scotland to visit my mum's area, but I never did get that opportunity.
Are there any relatives left there?
There are, yes, still quite a number of them.
Sounds
and
like
Mavis is too. My grandfather, Frank Mavis, came from England, and ended up. He had his marine engineer's papers ticket, and then emigrated to British Columbia. He was on the stern wheelers in the Yukon, and was chief engineer on one of the ships there that ended up. It got destroyed on the Yukon River. He told me that I read his letter, and I've since read accounts of it, that the captain's son was, our grandson, was on board as well, and they had a full load of dynamite stacked in cases on the front of the ship, because they were taking it from Whitehorse to Dawson City for the mines there, and for gold mining. And apparently, at one point, they're coming around down part of the river. The captain's nephew saw this geese on the river, and he went and grabbed the shotgun and ran forward to try and get a shot at these geese. And he tripped on an anchor and fell down, discharged the shotgun into the blasting powder cases on the front of the ship, and it blew the whole front of the ship off and set a fire. And my grandfather was down in the engine room, and he said he got a call from up above, and he said, the captain said, "Frank, put her hard astern and keep it there as long as you can, or else," he said, "we're all gone." And my grandfather threw the ship into stern, drive, and he ended up taking it up onto a gravel bar where it was grounded, and most of them were able to get off. Some were killed, of course, in the disaster, and the others had to walk all the way down the river, hike down the river to the first, I think it was telegraph post, where they could then wire for assistance.
And do you know anything about his father?
His father was credited with saving what is now the oldest standing structure in BC and the Yukon, and that's Fort Langley. Mm-hmm. He bought the fort, bought the building from the Hudson Bay Company, who sold it, and at the time, and turned it into a barn to keep sheep in. And he's now, as I said, credited with saving the oldest standing structure in BC and Washington State.
But did the government get involved?
Yes, the government ended up making the building a national park through the national parks, and it is now being recreated as Fort Langley with a stockade around it and other buildings inside as well.
And did they name anything after him, or?
They named the street that the fort's on, Mavis Street.
Wow.
In Fort Langley. And it's named after my family.
And anybody can go there now?
Anyone tall can go and visit it, and it's quite a popular site in BC.
Is it in fact a historic site?
Yes, it's a historic site.
Okay, and that was your great grandfather.
And he was my great grandfather, Alexander Mavis. Little Petra. He's a good girl, aren't you, Petra? Our little New York animal rescue dog.
And how long have you had her?
We've had her just about a year, a little over a year. She's 11 and a half years old, and a very nice little dog. We're just so pleased to have got her.
Yeah. And it's been nice to have you here at our cottage in Nova Scotia.
Oh, it's wonderful. We're being here with Ralph and Mary Lee, and on the edge of the bay here. It's a very beautiful spot. We just love it here.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Ross. Happy birthday to you.
Wow.
Many